Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial, Latin 101. And we have Caput IV, Chapter 4. Topics to be covered are second declension neuters, adjectives, present of sum, predicate nominative, and substantives. Let's start off with the first topic, second declension neuters. This is one of the keys to learning Latin. Latin, as you know, is a inflected language. It's all about the endings. And so here we have second declension neuter. And you can see it's largely the same as the masculine nouns, but we have a change in both the nominative and accusative, singular and plurals. And so instead of us, we have . Here it actually stays the same, although it's still a neuter noun. Here, instead of I, we have a, and instead of os, we have a. So once again, probably it's going to take a while, probably at least the entire first semester to get comfortable with this if you don't have a background in Latin. But we have to get comfortable with the fact that Latin is a case-based language, and that the endings indicate the cases or what the words mean. So we've mentioned that several times, but it takes a while to fully grasp and practice that, given the fact that it is a foreign language. So let's take a look at some examples. Again, if we were in the classroom, we would read this together. Obviously, you want to read it on your own at least a couple times, and then pay particular attention to the examples, as we will do. So here they give you some common words that are neuter. Only a careful study of the vocabulary will ultimately ensure that you recognize them as neuter. Once again, since we don't do a lot of English into Latin, really we just need to be able to recognize it versus being able to write it ourselves, in which case it would require probably a greater comprehension of the endings. But in this particular case, since we're largely reading Latin, just being able to recognize it and knowing the meaning of the root of the word or the vocabulary will make you quite successful in this. So here we have our endings. Going back again, this is just so important to learn the I, I, arm, is, us, o, I, or, mi, so, sis, and so on. And with continued practice, it'll get easier and easier. So again, please read through this. Here, what they're talking about is the fact that adjectives in Latin, which also have endings, need to agree in person, number, and gender with the noun that they're modifying. Again, this is new also for us in terms of English doesn't normally do this because English doesn't have endings. But Latin, the adjective needs to have the same ending or agree in the case and the number and the gender of the noun that it's modifying. Once again, in practice, especially at this point in Latin, most adjectives and the nouns that they modify will have the same ending or spelling, so it's pretty easy to recognize. We did mention before that Latin likes to put the adjective after the noun, whereas English puts it before. But really, I would argue that really this comes down to just knowing the vocabulary, which will contribute to a lot of success. Here we have the present infinitive and indicative of sum. And so this is just basic conjugation that we're going to need to memorize. And so the infinitive esse, which means to be, so we had the infinitive back in chapter 1. It just means to, and then whatever the word means. But here we have our conjugated forms of the verb to be. So sum is I am, sur, est, he, she, or it is, or there is. Sumus, we are, estis, sunt, they are. Notice it does follow the pattern of our esmus tisnit. Obviously, the first person singular is a little bit different, but here we have the S, here we have the T, here we have the mus, the tis, and the nunt. But since this isn't a so-called irregular verb, probably just needs to be memorized. So again, we'll take a look at some examples in a moment. And then here, predicate nouns and adjectives. This is generally, again, this may be a new idea for you, but we have it in English if we say that George Washington is the first president. Notice we use the connecting verb is to combine George Washington and first president. Or another good example would be Socrates is a man. So Socrates is conjoined or connected with man by the verb is. So in practice, this is not too difficult. Although when we see terms like predicate nouns, it may, if we're not familiar with grammar, raise some questions about what that means. Here they have some good examples, and here you can see that Virgilius and amicus are both in the nominative masculine singular. So here we have Virgilius and amicus, and then of Augustus Caesar, first emperor of Rome. So here's our translation. Here, this one's a little bit of an outlier, just because in Latin, the word poet is first declension, even though it's describing, in this case, a masculine subject. And so it's one of those words that is just the exception to the rule, if you will. And so Virgilius es poeta, not Virgilius es poetus, just because those words need to fit that declension. Again, this is something I've said before, but Latin nouns, and they will always be that declension. So the word poet will always be first declension. The word friend, amicus, will always be second declension. The word law, lex, will always be third declension. And so really once again, with repeated practice, you'll see the patterns. And so it's just something that has to be learned or memorized or internalized, however you want to look at it. But of course, that's the whole point of what we're doing here. Virgilius es magnus, here's a good example where it's us. Virgil is great, in other words, a great poet. Here we go, this one's a little more complex. The fame of Virgil is great. So here we know that of Virgil, of means genitive, or is genitive in this case. So there's our E. That's why it ends in the letter I. And so I said before, when I was learning Latin in the beginning levels, I always had a copy of the Latin noun declensions next to me as I was going through the Latin. Just otherwise, it's a lot easier when you can see it and gives you a little bit of confidence. So in this case, we need to be able to recognize this is in the genitive, and we can confirm that just by looking at it. And like anything else, the more you see it, the more you know. Here we have the girlfriends are good. There's AE. Why is that the case? Well, because it's plural. So there we go, AE. And so on and so forth. So we're not going to go through all of these, but you can see that they're all conjoined with some form of the verb to be. Most often est or sunt. In fact, most often in practice, it's going to be is, like the example of George Washington earlier. And so this first one would be the most common example. These other ones are possible, but it's less likely that we're going to encounter those with any kind of frequency. So take a look at those examples, obviously, because they are instructive. Here we have what are called substantive adjectives. Again, don't let the fancy terminology throw you off. It's pretty simple. All we're doing is using them descriptively. So here's an example. Many men are foolish. The men is sort of implied. So multi sunt stulti. Or they. And so we don't have a explicit, and they talk about that right here. We don't have an explicit name subject, but it's sort of implied, if you will. And so you have to often supply it in the translation. All right, so there's that right there. So I know we're going into this rather fast, but once again, I think it just makes sense to go into the examples and then refer back to these as necessary, because you'll want to read this carefully and give it a little bit of time so that it can soak in. Okay, so here we have our vocabula, and we mentioned before I would definitely go to the companion website, which I've indicated before. They do have some audio files, somewhat archaic, but still give you the basic sounds of these words. So here we have basium, basi, bellum, belli, concilium, concilii, cura, curae, donum, doni, exictium, exictii, and so forth. So definitely learn the vocab. And then once again, at some point, maybe in the next lesson, we'll talk about how to use a dictionary. But we need to learn both the nominative and the genitive form of the nouns for reasons which are just important, and will be especially so once you get a full understanding of Latin grammar. So here we have and e, because bellum, in fact, they have this word right here, that helpful, is a neuter noun, and so there's bellum, belli. And so because only the genitive indicates what declension a noun belongs to. So if you look at, Latin has a lot of repeated patterns, for example, ae, and os, and but only the genitive singular of the 5 declensions is unique. And so by learning the genitive singular, we're able to identify what declension a noun belongs to. But again, we'll talk more about that later. But that's why we have 2 words here, because we need to learn what declension. So E is second declension, neuter. AE is first declension. Why? Because if we look over here, here's the AE. So when we see the A, and as a rule, words that end in A, nouns that end in A, are first declension. Words that end in us are second. There's always exceptions. Remember, the ancient Romans didn't have this. This is something that grammarians put together over the centuries just to recognize the patterns. But just like in English, we don't think about grammar probably when we're speaking or even writing. And so grammar is helpful as a tool for learning, but there's the letter and then the spirit. All right, so take a look at that vocab, because we're going to need to know it for the exercises. So again, so far what you ought to be doing, as I've indicated for every chapter, is 1, to read through the chapter once or twice, to study or spend some time reading and thinking about the examples that they give with the translations. 3, learn the vocabulary, which we're right now, and you can just do that by studying them or using Quizlet or writing them down. And then 4th, you should be going to the back of the book and doing the self-tutorial exercises. I'm not going to jump to that right now because, to be honest with you, I'm not sure what page number it is, because this is the Kindle version, and not that it's difficult, but I'd have to track it down, so it could be any number one of these pages. But go in the back of the book, Chapter 4, self-tutorial, and then you have an answer key. I would do those first. In fact, that's what you should be doing, because 1, they're easier. 2, they recycle a lot of the vocabulary. And then 3, they're going to prepare you for the more difficult sententia antiquae, which we focus on in these video lessons. So please do that. Okay, so let's take a look at our exercises here. So I'll go ahead and open up a Google Doc just so we have it. And since it is Latin, I feel like I need to do Times New Roman, and we're going to call this Latin 101. Okay, so, and make that a little bit larger. All right, so that way we can have a written record of what we're doing here. Okay, so Fortuna caeca est. Again, this is based from Cicero. Again, this book is based on classical authors. This one's pretty easy. We've had these words before, so we should be able to recognize this means fortune or happiness or luck. So fortuna caeca est, here's our verb is. So if fortune is caeca, here they give it to us, it means blind. So remember, if a word is in italics, that's a possible translation. The words in quotation marks, those are derivatives that come from that Latin word in English. So this one's pretty easy. It just means fortuna caeca est. So we just say fortune is blind. So there we go. I'm getting easier than that. Now, just a couple of things. One, our adjective ends in A because our noun ends in A, but also because both fortuna and blind are being used as the subject of the nominative. So fortune is blind. We don't have any other information here, so we need at least a subject. So that's always the nominative in Latin. So fortuna caeca est, and then Latin likes to put the verb at the end. And so that one is fairly straightforward. Now, what does that mean? Because you have to, for each test, write a short reflection essay. Well, you need a little bit of luck. Unlike we modern human beings, as you know, I'm a philosopher, and we tend to overvalue freedom as a belief. When you look at human history, in the modern, certainly the 20th century, for example, a very violent century. Look at the wars, look at the poverty, look at the lives of quiet desperation. To quote Thoreau, this idea that everybody's free and happy clearly is an ideal. And, the ancients really didn't believe in that kind of self-determinism, that you need a little bit of luck in life. Some people seem to have more fortune than others. They tend to be happier than others. I can tell you as an educator, if you ever teach small children, we were small ones too, I think people are probably born with a temperament, but you can develop character, you can develop knowledge, but we probably are who we are by nature in terms of our inner lives. And most of us aren't aware of who we are, because Cicero here is following Socrates. So most people, according to Cicero, really don't live with a whole lot of self-knowledge because their attention is outward, even more so with technology and on their phones. And if people do live reflective lives, it's very intermittent or fleeting. Like Plato said, we're all sort of shadows to ourselves. Whereas Nietzsche said, we are unknown to ourselves, we men of knowledge. And so we could go on, but that's sort of the sense of it. We're not going to do that for all of these, obviously, but these all have some kind of insight or thought or provocation for thinking about life, if you will. Okay, let's take a look at duo. Si pericula sunt vera infernatus est. So here we have Terence, who is a Latin writer in the comedic tradition. I think we mentioned before that oftentimes for Terence and Plautus, I don't have the context here, but they may sound weighty, but they're probably meant in a kind of humorous, ironic kind of way. But again, I don't have that. They don't give us this is not a scholarly edition of Latin textbook. That is to say, doesn't give us citations. But it is from Terence. And let's see, so C means if. We've had that before. Pericula means dangers. And then sunt is are. Vera, where we get the word veracity, it means true. And then infernatus, unfortunate, and then s. So if the dangers are true, you are unfortunate. So let me write that out, and then I'll try to explain it in greater detail. So if the dangers are true, you are unfortunate. So let's take a look at this in greater detail. C just means if. Again, if we're not sure about this, we're going to have to use our Whitaker's or get a dictionary. We had this earlier in the book, but it's just a conjunction. It means if. Probably not if only. It doesn't make it whether. It's not. I don't think that's the sense of it either. So most of the time it's going to be if, but again, only the context will tell you that. So if pericula Now the pericula, go back to, so here is our vocabulary, periculum, periculi. But we have to be able to see the word "n" right here. That means it's neuter. It doesn't mean it's a noun. It means it's neuter. So it's a neuter noun, as your book points out. Again, this is detailed in the previous pages. So, but here we have but if we look at our declensions here, becomes a in the nominative plural. So we have to be able to recognize dangers in the plural form. So that's why it's dangers and not danger. Now, another clue, of course, is the fact that the verb is in the plural form, which is also one of our vocabulary elements in this chapter. So if I go back, so here we are, sunt, so which is third person plural. And so we just have to memorize sumus est, sumus este, sunt. And so we go back to the example here. We put it all together, and if the dangers are true. Now here we have our adjective vera, which is agreeing in person, case, and number with dangers. And so this is our adjective. The reason it ends in A is because it's nominative, neuter, plural. Again, if we're not sure about this, I think this is one of the virtues of Latin, like in the sciences. You got to take your time and actually think through it. And you got to, so here we have vera. Now, again, the challenge, of course, is you have many options. Well, that's just part of learning, is you got to make decisions. That's no different than in the hard sciences, is that there's many things you have to do for your calculations, for your measurements, for your methods. It's not just simple 1 + 1. And so Latin is no different. In fact, I would say it probably contributes to that scientific method in some way in terms of thinking. And so we have to be able to recognize that. Now, like anything else, if you go through this and even listening to the video and you're still not sure, well, then you're just going to have to memorize it. This is part of learning too. We had this conversation briefly during the first test. Remember, you've only been learning Latin 4 weeks. To be honest with you, you could learn Latin 20 years and Latin would probably still be difficult for you. In the sense that, you're reading Virgil in Latin, that's like reading Shakespeare's Hamlet in English. To really understand it is, a lot of hard work. And so you got to take it with a little bit of perspective in terms of what you're trying to do here. But the sentences are pretty short. It's not too difficult to memorize and learn, but there are ways to approach it both analytically, but also just in terms of just learning it. And you as a learner, of course, have to decide, what method or combination there works best for you. All right, so this is so S is, go back to, so here's a good example. We have sunt and S. So I go back here to so S, this means you are. So this example is a good one because it gives us both these new verb forms. And then infornatus S just means you are fortunate. So that one is pretty straightforward. Once again, it just shows that so much of learning a foreign language is just learning the vocabulary. If you learn the vocabulary, again, Shakespeare is easy if you know the vocabulary. If not, it's very difficult. No different in a foreign language. So, si pericula sunt vera infinatus es. Tres, salve o amici vir bonus es. So, greetings, literally, oh my friend, but greetings, my friend. You are a good man. Again, that sounds a little bit wooden in that translation, but nowadays a lot of people don't even say greetings, my friend. You just say, hey, what's up? Or you having a good day? But we just don't really talk like this. But remember, this is more writing than talking. And so that's another reason it's a little bit more formal. But greetings, literally, oh, my friend, but greetings, my friend, you are a good man. So let me write that out here. So greetings, my friend, if I can type here. And then, let's see, what is the semicolon here? So you are a good man. Now, this is helpful for a couple reasons, especially this last part. So we talked about this, how here English has 5 words, the Latin only has 3. So S means you are. So this is going to be new for many of you in terms of just conceptualizing it. But S means you are. So you can see English has 2 words, Latin has 1 word. But then you know, because we've talked about this and you've practiced this, that Latin doesn't generally use a or the. So we look at the example again. It just says vir bonus. Well, we can't just say you are a good man. That's bad English. And so we have to say you are a good man. Now the bonus is because it is masculine. What's challenging about this one is the word vir, which if I look it up here, you can see that it is second declension, but it doesn't end in us. So this is what we're talking about, where only the second declension genitive singular, which ends in I, will tell you that this is second declension. Why is that important? Because otherwise, we're not going to know that the adjective requires second declension bonus. So you can't say bonavir, that would be wrong. So you need to recognize that man is second declension, but only knowing the viri is going to indicate that. Now I can already sense some of you being a bit confused by this. Well, again, you've only had Latin 4 weeks. And so quite frankly, you might still be a little bit confused at the end of the year. Well, that's just because Latin is an entirely different grammar than English. And so you'll eventually get it, but that is the explanation, is it's vir, viri. So the genitive singular is second declension. So however we use the word man, it must be second declension. So here we're using it as the subject. So vir is our subject, and then bonus is our adjective. All right, moving on here. Quatuor, non bella est fama filii tui. This one's also a little bit complex in that if we don't recognize that the E is genitive singular, this one might be hard to read and translate. So remember, the genitive means of. So we have to be able to recognize that. Otherwise, this one might be a little tricky. So this means of your son. So we got to keep that in mind. Tui filii means of your son. So now the bella, this is where we may want to just look up the words, just like I'm doing here, is this one could be pretty, handsome, charming, pleasant, agreeable, polite, nice, fine, or excellent. So this one's going to be a little bit tricky to translate. So fama means reputation. So what it means is the appearance and reputation, or excuse me, the reputation of your son is not excellent, or is not fair. So the reputation of your son is not, we're going to go with excellent. You can say fine, you can say nice, or you can say pleasant if you want to. Let's go with that one. And so we're going to write that out here. The reputation of your son is not pleasant. Another tip, when you're learning Latin or any foreign language, don't use contractions. So say is not. Contractions are signs of a native speaker. And so since we're not native speakers in Latin, we want to keep it as formal as possible. So think about it, that to use American slang means you're probably an American. So very few people who learn English as a foreign language. It takes years and years, if ever, to learn slang, which contractions and the vernacular are. So it's just easier to use formal language. So let's go back to this here. So try to explain this here. So literally we have not not excellent is reputation of son your, or pleasant. So not pleasant is reputation of your son. But then we got to put it in a way that makes sense in English. So remember, this is the great Latin writer Horace. So we're going to have to think about how to write it and express it in English so it doesn't sound weird. Okay. Yeah, so there's our verb is, there's the adverb not, bella, fama are both adjectives, and then we have the genitive object here. All right. Quinque errare est humanum, the Stoic Seneca, and to err is human. So let's put that down. To err is human. So I'm going to keep it error, not error. Again, Latin, I think it is easier if you think of the Queen's English. So think of Elizabethan English. It's going to be a little bit easier. So to err is human, to forgive is divine, as Jonathan Swift once put it, among others. So this one's pretty easy. Errare is an infinitive, going back to chapter 1. How do we know that? Because it ends in A-R-E. Again, if we don't know that, we got to just look things up. And you can see here, present active infinitive. Again, the challenge with, obviously, even Whitaker's is you have a lot of other information, but we haven't had passive yet, so it doesn't make any sense to think it's passive. We haven't had perfect, so the only thing you've had that hopefully is recognizable is present tense. So it has to be this. And you can see it means to err, vacillate, go astray, wander. I think error is probably the best way to translate that. Human, that is a neuter noun. Or actually, it's an adjective in this case, so that's why we're getting humanum, because um right here. But again, I think this one we're just memorizing it. It's not too difficult. To err is human. This is one where I think for most people, just learning the vocabulary and learning it is going to be the easiest way. Once you start talking about the grammar, which we do, of course, unless you're some grammar nerd, it might be less helpful. Although it's still necessary, but I think if you don't get consumed, it's like anything else in life, it's called self-knowledge. You got to become aware of what works best for you. And yeah, other people like Dr. Thomas here and your other friends and your other professors or people in general, they're all going to have their opinions and their approaches, but at the end of the day, you gotta live your own life and play your own game. The result is to do it well. And so at the end of the day, if you don't know this already, I'm sure you do, but everybody I know, if you're doing a good job, it's friendly, it's moral, and it's interesting. And I don't know anybody that demands that you do it a certain way. Now, of course, a lot of power and a lot of societies like that, but certainly in higher education, the whole point of it is for knowledge and ideas and morality. And so I don't know anybody of my academic friends or my friends who went to West Point and are colonels in the military that are that petty and that narrow-minded where they think there's only one way to do something. At the end of the day, you're doing it in an excellent way. And if you do it in an excellent way, people will be happy with the results. So at the end of the day, we're looking for results. To be able to read Latin is quite an achievement. So if you can do it, no matter how you do it, you're successful. If not, you got to figure out a way to do it. All right, moving on here. Sex nihil est omnino beatum. So we have another one by Horace. And again, they give us a little bit of help. So omnino means holy. And then beatus, we've had before, can mean happy or fortunate. Again, we get the words beautify and beatitude in English. So some good Latin words here. And so what do we have here is that nothing is holy and then fortunate or happy. Of course, in English, you might say no one is completely happy. But that's just because we moderns tend to humanize everything in ways making about human beings, whereas the ancients were thinking more in terms of nature and just cosmos and existence, if you will. So there was always a metaphysics in their way of thinking. So the sense of it is really nothing is completely happy or wholly happy. So I'm going to keep it in a literal way. Why? Because when you're reading a foreign language, it's just not true that Germans think like Americans and Americans don't think like Germans. Um, the the Englishmen, the English don't think like Americans, at least not completely, and we don't think like the English. Well, similarly, right, it'd be very curious if somehow we thought completely like the Romans. In fact, we should probably be even more different than we are from modern peoples. And so the fact that I'm keeping it literal, even though the style seems off, I think it's truer to the original sense. And it's just another indication that sometimes things just aren't translatable, at least not in a simple, stylistically fallacious way. All right, so nothing is wholly happy. All right, so you can mull on what that means, but it is some food for thought. All right, here's a good one, Seneca. Again, Stoicism. What is Stoicism? Trying to discipline or educate our emotions. I think a lot of people misread Stoicism. It doesn't mean repressing your emotions. In fact, I think one reason people are less happy than they could be is they don't they don't understand their emotions, and so they're controlled by them in unconscious ways. What it means is understanding them. That's what discipline means in Latin. So if we look at just to kind of discipulus, means student, pupil, trainee, follower, disciple. Disco means to learn, to hear, to acquire knowledge or skills. So like so much else, we tend to think of discipline as something physical, whereas for the ancients, it was more inward. And it's just an important difference to note here. So that's sort of the context, if you will, or part of it, of that the remedy of anger is delay. And of course, we have that, right? Sometimes, I think I mentioned earlier, I think we are born with a temperament. Some people have a hot temper, and there's probably nothing they can do about it, quite frankly. But if they become aware they have a hot temper and they can maybe count to 3 before they say or do something, they're probably going to be better for it. Where if we just give in to our passions or our tempers, think of it like boxing, right? If a boxer went in there and just started swinging wildly in an angry manner because he or she doesn't like the opponent, well, that's great. But if you want to get knocked out, be angry. If you want to do bad on a test, get angry. If you want to die in a military battle, just get angry and start charging and yelling and letting them know where you're at. And so Stoicism, I think, has a lot of truth that generally speaking, anger, at least wild anger that lacks some kind of composure, probably does more harm than good. And so we need to find some way to overcome that. Mora, delay, hindrance, obstacle, pause. That's where we get the word moratorium in English. So I'm going to go with, the remedy of anger is delay. Keep it literal. Now, remedy is neuter. So that's why it ends in Of anger, irai ends in AE. So here's a good one. So, remedium irai est mora. So, remedium irai est mora. So we have I, and a, and then we have the verb est. So this one right here, a, and a, remedium irai est mora, is the remedy of anger is delay. Once again, stylistically, it sounds a little bit weird, but that's what we're going with so we can understand the original Latin. again, if we were publishing this for Princeton University, a new translation of Seneca's essays, we probably would have to be a little bit more creative with our translation, but in Latin 101, we're far from that publication. So I tried to keep it as literal as possible so we can follow the Latin in a more linear fashion. But this is a good example how we have I, and a. So really number 7, if you can understand number 7, you're in a good place for Latin at this point, because we have these different endings. And then we have the genitive, which in my experience tends to be difficult for students to grasp. And then we have some new vocabulary, and then just the abstract nature of the idea itself, which is one of the treats in Latin, I believe. You do a little bit of thinking versus we need a little bit more thinking, I believe. And so we put it all together, and the remedy of anger is delay. In other words, when you get angry, when you become angry, stop and think. All right, octo. Here we have Virgil. Bonus Daphnis, amicus meos, otium et vitam agricolae amat. So Daphnis is a pastoral character. There was a literary work. So good, we're gonna keep it Daphnis. So good Daphnis, my friend, loves the leisure and life of the farmer. So let me write this down. So good Daphne, my friend, loves, I can type here, the leisure and life of the farmer. Okay. So good Daphne, my friend, loves the leisure and life of the farmer. Let's see, did I spell Daphne right? How are they spelling it here? I guess they're saying Daphnis, which we'll go with that. So okay, so we'll just keep that original spelling. So bonus Daphnis, amicus meos, amat otium vitam agricolae. So we've had this before in the Horace. Remember, Virgil and Horace were contemporaries and they knew each other. So this idea of the simple life. Even today, when we think about Rome and Italy, you probably think about the vineyards and the countryside and living in a villa. And those of you that have had the opportunity to travel to Italy, I think that's even true of the Italian character today. So the Protestant work ethic, which is so built into our culture, is less obvious in Italy. And so they prefer the simple life, drinking wine and gardening and going to the beach. And yeah, so, but of course, we Americans like the simple life too. I think most people, if I'm being honest, would probably be happier living a simple life. Power and politics is a kind of competition. Not everybody's cut out for it rather. And so, anyways, you can ponder that meaning. But here's a good example. We have amicus meos, but then we have vitam and otium. Why? Because those are the direct objects. So otium, leisure, vitam, life, but then we have vitae, of the farmer. So we have to be able to recognize that is in the genitive, hence of the farmer. And then our verb all the way at the end is amat, which agrees with good Daphne. All right, let's see. Novem, magistri parvis pueris crustella et dona saepaedant. Here we get the word cookie or croutons, crustacean. Those of you in geology, oceanography might enjoy that word. So magistri, that's one of our vocabulary words. In fact, a lot of these are vocabulary words. I don't go back as much, maybe I should, just because it gets a little bit clumsy. But magister, magistri. In fact, here we had mora, morai, nihil, nothing. So notice that otium, leisure. A lot of these words that we're using in our examples, if you know the vocabulary, notice how you don't need to use Whitaker's words necessarily. It's kind of all right there. So magister, magistri means schoolmaster or teachers. And you can see these are all words in English that come from those Latin words, even the word miss, which is kind of interesting. All right, so we go back to the example here. And so, again, everything is present tense. So the teachers often give, remember Saipe means often, O-F-T-E-N. Dant, we had in chapter 1, means give. And then give what to whom? So the teachers often give cookies and gifts to the small children. So let me write that down, then I'll try to explain what that even means. So the teachers often give gifts and cookies to the small children. Now, what does that even mean? Well, remember, you got to remember ancient Rome. If you were a teacher, you were probably, remember, most people had no education beyond, the age of 10 or 11 until very recently. So if you had education beyond 10 or 11, you probably were very rich. And your parents hired a private tutor to tutor you in Greek and math and other subjects and rhetoric and philosophy, other subjects that were important for success politically, for example, in ancient Rome. Well, the teachers, in one sense, they were paid not by the state, as in contemporary times, so there was no state budget for these things. You were paid by rich Romans. And so obviously you wanted to make your clients, in this case your children, happy. Now, it was also a case where the parents expected the teachers to be strict on the children. So, and that was just part of, so they weren't just, babysitting them and giving them cookies. But rather they could use the rod and other forms of persuasion. In fact, that was often the case. But that's sort of the context of this. Again, we don't have the larger context of this, but it just means that maybe the children are also just more interested in cookies and cakes than they are in learning, which is probably still the case today, right? So life is complex. I'd like to think that we're interested in knowledge, wisdom, and virtue and truth, but let's be honest, bread and circuses is entertaining. So the teachers often give gifts and cookies. Now let's explain the gifts and cookies. That is second declension accusative plural. So crustula dona, that is in the plural because those are both neuter nouns. But then we have to the small children. Notice that those two words end in is because that is plural dative. Because the dative is to or for whom something is done. We mentioned that before. So dative is normally a person, to or for whom, and that's why it ends in is. This one's a little bit complex just because we have I, is, a, nunt, and then we have adverbs and we have a conjunction. So this one is pretty complex. Again, it just might just need to be memorized, but here we have the nominative plural subject second declension. Here we have second declension dative plural. Here we have second declension neuter accusative plural. Here we have an adverb, and here we have third declension plural dant. So again, you might need to look up these words in Whitaker's Words, and even then, yeah, this one is complex given our Latin so far. All right, let's do one more here. Decem. Amicam meam magis quam oculos meos amo. So magis quam means more than. So I love my friend more than my eyes. So let me write that down and we'll try to decipher that. So I love my friend more than my eyes. Now, what does that even mean? Well, that beauty's only skin deep. Yeah, I mean, we're perhaps attracted to someone or something by appearances. Think of modern consumerism. If it's new and shiny, people like it, but after a while, once it loses its luster, you probably don't have the same kind of attraction to it or him or her. And so that seems to be the sense of it here, although you can come up with your own interpretations. What's important grammatically is amo is I love, so we've had this word before. And then here's our direct object, amicam meam, because it ends in am. So now amicam, because it does end in am, it could mean girlfriend as well. So it could be sweetheart. In fact, that's probably it. So it is definitely a female direct object. So if you want to say sweetheart or girlfriend or female friend, mistress might be a little bit too strong. I don't know about concubine or courtesan. That seems a little bit of a stretch, perhaps. But again, I don't know the context. But we could change that to I love my sweetheart. Oops, I can type here. More than my eyes, or my girlfriend. You can decide what you want to do here. Now, in case you're wondering, if it were amicum and not amicam, then it would mean male friend. So this is female, generally feminine. This is masculine. So knowing your endings and your declensions will help with that. And then we mentioned before, this is probably just going to have to be memorized. Now, more than oculos meos, that also is in the accusative. So this one has two accusatives. One as the direct object, two in terms of the comparative more than my eyes. So that's what's going on there. All right, we're just going to do 1 through 10. Although here's a good one, right? Infinite is the number of dumb people, right? So, but anyways, for that, we'll just do 1 through 10. All right, so here's the great Roman statesman Cicero, 106 to 43 BC. And here we have a great reading called The Rarity of Friendship from Cicero's day, Amicitia. And it was a famous essay on friendship, and you can read about its context, but it is a very eloquent sort of reflection on the importance of friendship in terms of, following Aristotle and Plato and many others is, for Cicero, a true friend is somebody with whom you have a inner bond, a spiritual affinity, where you and that other person find yourselves in the same place in your lives and you're striving for something in unison. And so the relationship is not merely temporal or transactional or one of convenience or acquaintance, but rather contributes to something lifelong in terms of who you become, and you remain an individual according to this view of friendship, but your friend is helps you become an individual and vice versa. So a good example of this might be in Lord of the Rings, if you've seen it. And of course, Sam tells Frodo that I can't carry it for you, referring to the ring. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. And so it'd be a good example of friendship. So hopefully you have, let's be honest, many people don't have a lot of friends. And, sadly, many people never have a true friend. And so it goes back to the idea of fortune, and life isn't fair, but if you have been lucky enough to have a true friend, it is quite rare. But even though it doesn't exist, you can still believe in it, because if you don't believe in it, then that may be the reason why you haven't found a true friend. And so, well, I've actually taught a course on friendship before. So friendship is kind of interesting. And, once again, I think there's nothing new about social media, but we do know that it tends to stay on the surface. But let's be honest, that's probably always been the case. And so the search for happiness continues. Okay, let's read this here. Pauci viri veros amicos habent, et pauci sunt digni. Amicitia vera est praeclara, es omnia praeclara sunt rara. Multi viri stulti de pecunia semper cogitant, pauci de amici sed errant. Possimus valere sine multa pecunia, sed sine amicitia non valimus, et vita est nihil. All right, so here we have is that that few men have true friends, and few are worthy. True friendship is illustrious, and all things illustrious are rare. Many stupid men always think about money, few about friends, but they are wrong. We are able to be well without much money, but without friendship, we are not able to be well, and life is nothing. All right, so let's take a look at this here. So we have pauci viri veros amicos habent. So let's go ahead and put this right down here. We'll call this the rarity of friendship. And I don't want that. It's right there. And okay. And let's go back and take a look here. So few men have true friends. So few human beings. So few men have true friends. So notice this uses some of the vocab that we had earlier. And again, if you do the self-tutorial exercises, you'll have even more of this vocab. So pauci viri, that is our subject in the plural. That ends in I. But then we need to be able to recognize that veros amicos is the accusative direct object in the plural second declension. And then habent is just our verb, agreeing with few men. So pauci viri amicos veros habent. There's our pauci viri. There's our amicos. And then habent is our verb. And few are worthy. In other words, let's be honest, because according to Cicero, few are worthy. According to Cicero, if you're not a moral person and you don't strive for excellence, then that's not true friendship according to him. And so that kind of person will just hold you back, unfortunately. So you probably, according to Cicero, iron sharpens iron, as it says in the book of Proverbs. And so if you're hanging around people that are just not doing a whole lot of anything, that's great, but it's not going to help you develop inwardly, is sort of the idea here. And few are worthy. Why? Because friendship is, now they do have some vocab down here. In fact, let's go with splendid for praeklaros. Remember, claros is where we get the word clear, but we're going to go splendid or remarkable. So then we go back to the reading here. True friendship is remarkable. So true friendship is remarkable. So true friendship, vera amicitia, is S, and then remarkable. Again, we have our adjective ending in A because the noun it's modifying ends in A, amicitia. Of course, here we have sort of two adjectives. This is our predicate nominative, which is talked about earlier in the chapter. And all splendid things are rare. Or everything, yeah. So this could be and everything splendid is, but then we change the verb to the singular. So I'm going to say and all splendid things are rare. So we're kind of adding a things, which all splendid things are rare. As you know, often in writing, you want to avoid the word things, but in this case, I think it fits. So omnia praeclara sunt. Omnia, A. Why? Because everything is in the nominative first declension singular subject ending. So A. Right? Many stupid men always think about money. Now, stolti, that's one of our vocab words. Let me go back here just to show you how. So stultus, or foolish. Actually, foolish actually sounds a little bit better. But it is where we get the word stupid, S-T-U, so, or dumb. But we'll go with foolish. And we could probably change that one we had earlier, but I'm not going to. But so many foolish men always think about money. So let's put that right there. So many foolish men always think about money. And by the way, I would say that Cicero had a lot of money. But another good example in the American political tradition would be Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin had a lot of money, because he was a hard worker and opened many businesses and was a self-made man. But he also had wisdom and character and friendship. And so we can do both. That's sort of the ideal, is we got to be practical. We got to make money, got to get a job. You got to have fun in life, but hopefully life is more than just simple mercurial pleasures, that there's something more enduring, and perhaps friendship and love, both of which are rare, are the paths to happiness, is the suggestion here. We don't have many roads to happiness, and I would like to think friendship is one of them. So many foolish people always think about money. Always think about money. So sempre means always. And then about money. Few about friends. So few about. Oops. Now the day we had before in chapter 1. The day it means about, and it's always followed by the ablative. So first declension ablative singular is a. But then second declension ablative plural is is. So if we look at our endings here, so there it is, second declension ablative plural is. Why? Because day means about is always followed by the ablative. We had this in chapter 1. If you can't recall, you got to take a look at the grammar here. And once again, it could be from is its most common way to translate it. So, few about friends, but they are wrong. But they are wrong? Oh, it's just a colon there. Semicolon. But they err. Okay, you could say they are wrong too. So, and then we are able. Notice we are able is possimos. So mus is we, possu is are able. So put all together, possimos probably just needs to be memorized, means we are able. And then to be well, there's our infinitive. So possimos volere, we are able to be well. Here's another tricky part of English and Latin, is English has, once again, 6 words, whereas the Latin only has 2 words. So possimos volere, we are able to be well. Sort of the virtue of Latin, less is more. Sine multa, without much money. Without much money. So notice we picked up the pace a little bit, so you may have to watch this part of the video a couple times. But sine means without, also followed by the ablative. We had this earlier in the book. So both de and sine are always followed by the ablative. So sure enough, first declension ablative singular is a with the macron, hence a with the macron, first declension ablative singular a. And then we just need to know the vocab. So we are able to be well without much money, but without friendship we are not well, and life is nothing. But without friendship we are not well, and life is nothing. Yeah, so what a way to conclude that, huh? But without friendship we, mus, are not well, so non valemos, et end, vita, life, est, is, nothing. So here we have our new one of our new grammar concepts, the verb to be, third person singular, is. All right, so we had a lot of Latin. I will be going over the answers to the test once everybody takes the test. I'll do that in another video. I plan on another test in about probably 3 weeks, to be honest, at the end of October. And this chapter has a lot of good Latin that needs to be learned. And also the kinds of essay questions. What observations does Cicero make here on the rarity of friendship, and how is his perspective similar to that as Horace? In the passage from his satires, which you read in the preceding chapter. In other words, about what is happiness. So those are the kind of essay questions. And then you can see the importance of Latin for other languages. So hopefully you're reading this on your own. In the next chapter, we actually go into the future and past tenses, first and second. So next week is going to focus on verbs. All right. Happy learning. And as always, post questions or send me an email if you have specific questions. But again, learn the vocabulary, read through the chapter, focus on the examples, do the self-tutorial exercises, and then hopefully the self-tutorial video that we're doing here will make a lot more sense. Valite.